They talk stocks and gold, but all I heard was the sound of my own worth being discounted. The night my father called me a failure was the night I learned what silence could do. The Richardson mansion gleamed like something out of a magazine, gold light spilling through tall windows, laughter echoing from the dining room like an orchestra rehearsed to perfection. From the outside, it looked like a celebration. Inside, it felt like a courtroom. The silverware gleamed sharper than the smiles, and I could already sense what was coming the same way you feel a storm before it hits. They didn't invite me to dinner with my family. They invited me for a show. The table was long polished to a mirror set for 12. My father sat at the head, commanding as ever in his navy suit. My mother Linda wore pearls that caught the chandelier's light. To their right, my brother Luke scrolled through his phone, the glow reflecting off his smug grin. I sat near the end, not by accident. It was my usual place, the invisible seat. The help poured wine. The conversation buzzed about stocks, real estate, and expansion plans. Then, as if on cue, my father turned his gaze toward me. "So, Anna," he said, swirling the red in his glass. "Still working that receptionist job?" The room quieted. I could feel everyone watching, pretending to be polite while waiting for the punchline. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone steady. "Still paying my own rent, too." Luke laughed, that kind of short, mean laugh that comes from someone who's never been told no. "Rent," he echoed. "God, that's depressing. You should come back home, or at least get a job that pays more than sympathy." Linda smiled faintly, the way she always did before delivering something cruel. "Your brother's only teasing, sweetheart. But your father and I do worry. You're 30, and we'd hoped by now you'd have found stability." Stability. That word again. It followed me since college, every Thanksgiving, every birthday dinner, every attempt at independence. It meant, "You're not one of us." It meant, "Don't embarrass the family." Dad leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the silence his words created. "Stability," he repeated, savoring it like a fine wine. "That's the difference between dreamers and builders. You can't afford to dream when you can't even afford a home." There it was. The line. The strike. The sound of glass shattering without a single thing breaking. I could have argued. I could have told him about the architecture scholarship I turned down because he said it wasn't a real degree. I could have told him how my boss at the firm said I had the sharpest eye for design he'd seen in 20 years. But I didn't. I cut my steak slowly, precisely. The knife scraped the plate, slicing through the tension better than my words ever could. Luke grinned wider. "Come on, Dad," he said. "Don't be too hard on her. Some people just aren't wired for success. That's okay. We need dreamers too. They make great assistants." The laughter rolled down the table like a wave, hitting each face in turn. Aunts, cousins, even my mother, all playing their parts in the family theater. No one dared to break character. For a moment, I stared at the flicker of the fireplace reflected in the wineglass. Then I smiled, a small, practiced smile that hid the sting. "You're right, Luke," I said softly. "Some people aren't wired for success. Some have to build their own." He blinked, not sure if I was joking. I wasn't. The dinner moved on, conversation shifting back to markets and mergers. I let their voices fade into a dull hum like static in the background of a bad memory. But inside me, something was shifting. Not rage that was too simple. It was resolved. A quiet, precise kind of resolve that didn't need to shout to be heard. After dessert, as everyone gathered near the fireplace for brandy, my father launched into another speech about legacy. He loved that word. Legacy, he said, tapping his chest, isn't built by chance. It's inherited by those who have the discipline to carry it. His eyes flicked to me. Unfortunately, not everyone does. The others murmured in agreement. Luke clinked his glass against Dad's, pride gleaming between them like a shared secret. I set my glass down, the sound crisp and deliberate. "You're right," I said quietly. "Legacy isn't inherited. It's earned." For the first time that night, he looked caught off guard. His hand froze halfway to his drink. I didn't wait for a reply. I stood, thanked my mother for dinner, and left. Outside, the winter air cut through my coat sharp and clean. The mansion behind me glowed warm against the darkness, a monument to everything they believed I wasn't. I walked to my car, the old Honda Civic, my father once called an embarrassment. The engine coughed twice before starting, the headlights catching the frost on the driveway. I gripped the steering wheel and took a breath that felt heavier than it should have. They thought I'd walk away defeated. But as the gates of the estate closed behind me, something inside me opened. All those years of dismissal, of being told I wasn't enough, they weren't wounds anymore. They were blueprints. That night I drove through the city past the skyline my father helped design. Glass towers, glowing penthouses, symbols of power I could never touch. But somewhere between those glittering buildings, I saw something else, cracks in the foundation. Not physical, but moral. And I realized then that the Richardson empire wasn't as solid as everyone thought. At a red light, I pulled out my phone and opened an old note I'd written years ago. Haven Homes design affordable, sustainable housing with dignity. I hadn't looked at it since college. I'd written it after a professor told me my ideas were too emotional to be profitable. Now, reading it again under the city lights, I felt the same flicker I had that day, a spark that hadn't died, just buried. The light turned green. I didn't rush forward. I watched it glow, steady and silent. If they thought I'd never afford a home, I thought they were right. Because I wasn't going to buy one. I was going to build them. And someday they'd sit at another dinner table, maybe even in one of my homes, and choke on the legacy they'd tried to bury me under. That night, the city didn't seem so cold anymore. It looked like a blueprint, and for the first time in years, I wasn't their failure. It was my own beginning. I didn't plan to return to that house so soon, but life has a cruel sense of humor. 3 weeks after that dinner, my mother called. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, but the tremor beneath it gave her away. "Your father's lawyer requested your presence," she said. "It's about the family estate." I almost laughed. The family estate, the empire that had cut me out years ago. "I wasn't aware I was still on the list," I said. "You are now," she replied softly. The Richardson law offices sat downtown, high above the streets my father once called the veins of his city. The walls were glass, the kind meant to reflect success back at anyone who entered. When I stepped inside, I felt the chill of air conditioning and old power. Luke was already there, leaning against the window with a coffee in hand, wearing that same expensive smugness he called confidence. He smirked as soon as he saw me. "Didn't think you'd show." "I almost didn't," I said. "But curiosity pays better than pride." Before he could reply, the lawyer entered, Mr. Harris, my father's legal shadow for decades. He was gray thin and moved like someone who'd memorized every word before speaking it. "Your father has amended his will," he began, glancing at me. "He wanted both of you here when I read the changes." Luke chuckled. "Let me guess. He's leaving Anna a participation trophy." Mr. Harris's thin lips remained a straight line, his expression utterly neutral, a mask perfected by years of witnessing family drama. He wasn't paid to judge. "Your father instructed that this meeting be recorded and witnessed." He pressed a button on the recorder. He wrote this statement personally. He opened a leather folder and read aloud. "To my children Luke and Anna, legacy is built by strength, not sentiment. Luke, you've carried the family name with ambition. Anna, you've carried your ideals with stubbornness. But I've come to see that both have their place. Therefore, I am dividing the Richardson estate equally between you." The room fell silent. The words hung there, absurd in their weight. Luke's head snapped toward me. "He wouldn't," Mr. Harris continued. "However, this division is conditional. Anna will receive her share only if she agrees to take an active role in the family business within 6 months. Otherwise, her portion reverts to Luke." There it was, the catch. My father's ghost is still pulling strings, trying to reel me back into the empire I'd escaped. Luke grinned like he'd already won. "Well, that's generous. I'll start drafting my thank you speech." I met his eyes. "Don't get too comfortable. 6 months is a long time." He laughed. "You in business. You wouldn't last 6 weeks." I didn't answer. Not because he was wrong, but because he had no idea how right he might be, or how far I'd go to prove him wrong. After the meeting, my mother waited by the elevator. She looked smaller somehow, her pearls dimmed under the fluorescent light. "He thought this would bring you back," she said quietly. "Into what? His world. Into the family." Her voice cracked on the last word. I wanted to tell her the truth that there hadn't been a family in that house for years, only shareholders with matching DNA. But I didn't. I just nodded and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed between us like a verdict. That night I sat in my apartment, the will spread across the table beside an untouched dinner. The city lights flickered through the blinds, cold and electric. I stared at the words until they stopped being words and started feeling like chains. Return to the business, not an invitation, but bait. I picked up my phone and scrolled through old photos, my father in front of a half-built tower, Luke holding a golden shovel at a groundbreaking ceremony, me in the background, blurred, almost erased. I remembered being 16, showing my father the first 3D model I ever built. He'd said cute, but real builders work with steel, not pixels. That sentence had carved itself into my bones. That memory used to sting. Now it clarified the blueprint. Looking at the paper again, I realized something he'd just given me: access to the one thing he never meant to his own empire. A door he built to trap me could become my way in. The next morning I drove to Richardson Estates headquarters. The security guard looked surprised when I gave my name. "Miss Richardson, are you back?" I smiled. "Something like that." Inside, the lobby smelled like polished marble and money. I passed portraits of my father, through the decades, younger, prouder, colder. Each one watched me like a warning. The receptionist, a woman my age, froze when she saw me. "Oh, Miss Richardson, we weren't expecting." "It's fine," I said. "No one ever does." I found my father's old office, a mahogany desk, framed skyline photos, the same leather chair that once dwarfed me when I was little. For a long moment, I just stood there. The air felt heavy with ghosts. Then I sat down, opened my laptop, and pulled up the Haven Homes file I'd started years ago. If I had 6 months to prove myself, I wouldn't do it by continuing his legacy. I'd do it by rewriting it. I began drafting a proposal, a sustainable housing division under Richardson Estates, modern, low-cost builds, using local materials and green design. I'd pitch it as innovation. But in truth, it was infiltration. My father built skyscrapers for the elite. I'd build homes for the forgotten under his company's name on his dime. Luke would laugh. The board would scoff. But if I could get one investor to believe in me, if I could make the numbers work, I'd meet the will's condition and change the direction of the empire without asking permission. I worked until sunrise. The city outside glowed pale blue, the color of exhaustion and resolve. My hands trembled from caffeine, but my pulse stayed steady. At 7, Luke called. "So, sis," he said, his voice smug, even through the static, ready to back out yet. "No," I said. "I'm in." He laughed. "Good. Watching you crash will be the best entertainment I've had all year." "Then keep watching," I said, and hung up. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their world. I was shaping it. The will had been meant to control me, but it had done the opposite. It had given me a weapon, a 6-month window to turn their legacy into my blueprint. I closed the laptop, pushed back the chair, and looked out the window. The skyline my father built loomed in the distance, glass and steel glinting in the sun. I remembered his words from that dinner: "You'll never afford a home." He was right. I wasn't going to afford one. I was going to own the ground they were built on. And one day when they came looking for their legacy, they'd find it under my name. The first week back inside Richardson Estates felt like walking through a museum of everything I wasn't allowed to touch. Every corridor smelled of polished ambition, glass walls, chrome fixtures, and whispers that stopped the moment I passed. I didn't need a welcome party to know I was an intruder. Luke strutted through the halls like a crowned prince. Every intern smiled too quickly, every manager laughed too loudly. He loved the attention, loved the control. I watched from my cubicle, the one they temporarily assigned me, in the corner across from the supply closet. The CEO's daughter became a glorified intern. My father would have found it poetic. Still, I wasn't there for comfort. I was there for access. On my second day, I opened my laptop and began sketching digital models of compact homes efficient and modular, designed to use half the resources of our high-rise projects. Haven Homes, Phase 1. I worked quietly the way thieves do when stealing back what's theirs. Every keystroke was an act of defiance. By noon, Luke's voice broke the rhythm. "Anna," he called across the open floor. "Can you grab us some coffees? The board's in a meeting and you're not exactly busy." Laughter scattered around the room. I looked up slowly. "Sure," I said. "Milk, sugar, or both? Surprise me?" he said, turning back to his colleagues, like a man who believed the world turned on his axis. I walked to the cafe across the street, the air thick with late summer heat. My reflection in the glass door caught me off guard, Blazer's slightly wrinkled hair pinned back, eyes sharp. I looked nothing like the woman they thought they'd humiliated. When I came back, Luke was still talking, gesturing wildly about quarterly growth projections. I set his cup in front of him. "Black," I said. "Strong, you'll need it." He didn't even look up, but I saw his jaw tighten. A small win, invisible to everyone but me. That evening when the office emptied, I stayed. The silence after hours felt like freedom. I walked into the conference room, the one lined with blueprints of towers that kissed the clouds, and spread my sketches across the table. Small homes, affordable communities, renewable materials. It was everything my father had dismissed as naive. But standing there under the hum of fluorescent lights, I saw what he never did. Legacy wasn't measured in square footage. It was measured in who got to belong. The door clicked. I froze. A man stepped in, early 40s sleeves, rolled a folder under one arm. He looked surprised. "You're still here," he said. Apparently, I replied. "And you are Ethan Cole," he said, offering a hand. "Senior architect. Your father hired me before." He paused, realizing the weight of the word before. "Before everything changed." I shook his hand. "Anna Richardson. Receptionist. Coffee runner. Occasional troublemaker." He smiled faintly. "I heard." Luke made sure everyone knew the prodigal daughter was back. "Good," I said. "Then I don't have to explain myself." His eyes flicked to the sketches. "These aren't from the current portfolio." "No," I said. "They're from the future." He studied them, the angles, the material notes, the sustainability tags. "Affordable builds under the Richardson name," he murmured. "That's bold." "It's necessary." He nodded slowly. "You'll need backing. The board won't go for this unless someone with authority pushes it. Then I'll make them see it." He laughed softly. "You sound like your father." The words hit harder than he meant them to. "No," I said quietly. "I sound like what he could have been if he'd believed in more than himself." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he picked up one of the sketches and held it against the light. "This design," he said, "could work in Crown Point, that land we abandoned after the sinkhole scare." I looked at him. "Is it stable? With the right foundation?" "Yes, it's risky. So am I." He grinned. "Then you'll fit right in." For the first time in years, someone inside Richardson Estates wasn't laughing at me. They were listening. We spent hours refining the planned modular units that could adapt to different terrains, community gardens, shared solar grids. It wasn't just architecture. It was a rebellion disguised as business. At 2 a.m, the city outside was a web of lights and silence. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temples. "You know Luke's going to fight this, right? He'll call it charity weakness, whatever word helps him sleep at night." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm not asking for his approval. I'm building proof." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You remind me of someone I used to know. A designer who believed buildings could change people. What happened to him? He stopped believing." I looked at the blueprints spread between us, fragile paper, bold ideas. "Then maybe it's time someone started again." We locked the designs in a folder and labeled it simply Project Haven Homes. When I finally stepped outside, the night air felt alive. I drove home with the windows down, the city's heartbeat pounding in sync with mine. For the first time, I wasn't running from my family's shadow. I was sketching my way out of it. The next morning, Luke called an all-hands meeting. He stood at the front of the conference room, the skyline blazing behind him. "We're tightening budgets," he announced. "No unnecessary experiments. No charity projects." His eyes landed on me. "We build for profit. Always." I smiled politely. "Noted." Ethan caught my glance from across the room, a silent acknowledgement. We both knew what charity projects meant. Haven Homes had already rattled him. After the meeting, Luke cornered me by the elevator. "Don't get ideas," he said. "Dad gave you 6 months, not 6 chances." "I only need 1, I replied. He stepped closer, his breath sharp with arrogance. "You think you can outplay me? I don't have to," I said. "I just have to build something that lasts longer than your ego." The doors opened. I stepped in before he could respond. As they closed, I caught his reflection, angry, confused, maybe a little afraid. That night I met Ethan at a quiet diner downtown. Over coffee, we went over budgets, logistics, and potential investors. He warned me about the board's politics, the whispers about nepotism, the fear of change. "Then let them whisper," I said. "Because while they're talking, we'll be building." He smiled. "You really believe this could work?" "I don't believe it," I said. "I know." Outside, the streetlights stretched long shadows across the pavement. I thought of my father's voice, his laughter echoing through the mansion that used to be mine. "You'll never afford a home." Maybe I wouldn't. But I'd build 1,000 of them. And everyone would stand as proof that I didn't need his permission to exist. By the time fall settled in the air, carried rain and deadlines like twin promises. Inside Richardson Estates, the same opulent hush mahogany cigars, the low hum of men who measured the world in square footage. I moved through it like a shadow, unseen by design, studying the seams. The less they noticed me, the more I learned where they were weak. Ethan and I had sharpened Haven Homes into something that looked inevitable on paper renderings, that slid into spreadsheets, timelines that learned to breathe with the money. Our prototype could house neighborhoods for the cost of one of Luke's penthouses. Numbers didn't make it real. People did. But first we needed someone to believe the math was more than sentiment. "We're ready," Ethan said that morning, leaning over my desk. "Now we just need someone who believes in impossible things. Or someone who hates my brother enough to write a check," I answered, closing the laptop. He grinned like he liked where my answers were going. The boardroom the next day felt like an arena, glass walls that reflected the skyline and the long table built to accommodate egos. Luke presided at the head like a man born to applause. When I walked in, he didn't bother masking his amusement. "Well, well," he said loud enough for his little audience. "The creative department's here." "What is it this time?" "Anna coloring books for contractors." I set the binder on the table. "Affordable housing. Sustainable development. Project Haven Homes." He clipped the binder shut as if the paper might burn him. "This isn't a charity. We build for profit." "Profit and purpose aren't opposites," I said. I felt the room tilt, a small gravity shift toward me. I clicked the remote. Prototype homes rolled across the screen in luminous renderings, tight, efficient spaces that still felt human. Modular builds, lower costs, faster timelines. Half the materials, half the time, better return in community trust. "Expand Richardson where no one else will touch," I said. Ethan walked through the fiscal side, government partnerships, green grants, market expansion. The board listened because numbers are polite and hard to dismiss. Luke's jab came anyway. "Innovation equals risk," he said. "My father built towers, not toy boxes." "Your father also engineered a hierarchy that forgot the people inside his towers," I said. "Maybe it's time we built something that remembers them. Silence, the kind that tastes like teeth on tongue." Mr. Grayson cleared his throat. "Interesting proposal. Proof of concept is required." "Give me one site," I said. "One project." Luke didn't hide his triumph. "Fine. Crown Point. That land's worthless. Make a miracle." He smiled like he'd handed me a noose. I saw it differently, a scar demanding stitches. Crown Point was where the company's pride had bled out. Years ago, the soil had betrayed a luxury development, sinkholes, rusted rebar, abandoned machinery half swallowed by weeds. Investors had jumped ship. My father had slapped a write-off on it and moved on. When the meeting ended, Ethan pulled me aside. Crown Point. Are you serious? Exactly, I said. No one will pay attention until it works. You know, if it fails, Luke will bury you. Then I better build faster. The sabotage began predictably elegant. Permits delayed. Lost emails. Budgets shaved with comfortable hands. I found my allocation cut in half one afternoon. The accountant avoided my eyes. Orders from above. Luke breezed past, espresso in hand. Problem, sis? He asked. Don't overextend. I watched him fade down the corridor and whispered to the carpeted silence, overextend. You'll see what that word really means. That night I drove out to Crown Point. The approach road frayed into potholes and ragged weeds. The gate sagged, rust blooming along its hinges like a wound. I parked on a patch of broken asphalt and got out the wind smelling of iron and damp earth. The sight was worse in daylight than in reports. Where foundations had been poured, concrete had broken away in jagged teeth. Rebar stuck up like broken ribs. Machinery lay half-buried orange with rot. Tall grasses had colonized the place, a green conspiracy that softened edges and hid failures. Puddles sat like black mirrors where concrete had failed to set. The place had a silence you could walk into and feel judged by. I walked the perimeter with my boots sinking into the wet dirt, and something in me shifted. I listened to the sound of that rotten ground. It wasn't just land that failed. It was other people's certainty, the arrogance that believed money could paper over everything. Standing there, I felt the history of dismissal settle into my shoulders. Father's dismissal. Luke's laughter. The constant judgment that I'd never belong here or anywhere permanent. This place, this dead land, was proof of pride's rot. My phone buzzed. Ethan. You really went? He asked. Already here, I said. A week later, I met Grace Layton on a rooftop that smelled of espresso and city wind. Grace, who'd built and unbuilt her own fortunes, read my proposal like it was a map she wanted to walk. Send me the details, she said. If the math works, I'll back the first phase. Why, I asked. She looked at me like she'd seen the same stubbornness in younger versions of herself. Because I like stories where the underdog wins. When Grace signed, the stage shifted. The public weight of an investor's confidence let us move from rhetoric to concrete. I drove back past the mansion that night, parked across the street, and watched Luke's house glow. They fed their vanity with perfect meals, while I fed mine with plans. They thought I was still the girl eating ramen in a beat-up car. They didn't see the blueprints stacked on my kitchen table, or the investors who had chosen a project over pedigree. Crown Point was still a graveyard of steel and weed, but there beneath the rust and rot something else existed, a scaffolding for resolve. If I could pull this out of the mud, it wouldn't just be my victory. It would be evidence proof that a failed place could become a home. And when the walls rose, when families moved in and children learned the routes of their own streets, they would be living proof that being written off was not forever. They'd live on land the family had declared dead. That thought steadied me more than any boardroom applause ever could. I turned the engine over and drove away. The map of Crown Point still burned into my retinas. The land was broken. I felt its shape. The rest of the project would be about learning how to mend it and how to mend myself in the process. Crown Point in daylight reads like a confession. Mud squatted in depressions, the soil pocked and tired. Rust hung from half-buried equipment like barnacles. Where concrete had been poured, it had cracked into a constellation of fault lines. Weeds had staged a small patient takeover, threading through bolts, and concrete softening the edges of ruin with indifferent green. I stepped forward and felt the ground whisper under my boots, unstable, but not without purpose. The first week was an education in humility. Engineers came and pointed at things I hadn't known to name. Soil samples were taken with slow ceremonial care. Test results, printed and annotated in margins that read like a different language. Every suggestion of repair carried a cost. Every repair required conviction. When the project manager said, "This will take resources," he was underestimating what would be needed, not just materials, but stubbornness. Ethan stood beside me with a clipboard and a look that read, "We do this or we go home." "It's worse up close," he said. "It's honest," I corrected. We pored over plans, reinforced footings, drainage, re-engineered materials upgraded. The foundation couldn't be a bandage. It had to be architecture that refused to admit defeat. That meant redesigning everything to address the land's weakness rather than wish it away. I remember the moment the first trucks arrived, cement mixers, bird workers clustered under the low September sky. Rain threatened gray and patient like a judge waiting to see if our work would hold. I wrote my initials on one of the foundation forms before the pour a ridiculous private ritual, Anna Richardson, Haven Homes, Phase 1. When the concrete came, when the mixer's teeth emptied their wet gray burden into the molds we'd cut into the ground, I pressed my palm to the edge and felt the cool weight take shape. It was an imprint that said I was here. I claimed this. The work stripped me down to a cadence I hadn't known I needed. I stopped keeping score on petty humiliations and started keeping count of bolts tightened. Hours worked, inspections passed. At night I dreamed about measurements. I woke with the taste of concrete dust in my mouth. When Luke's voice leaked across the office, a mocking voicemail, a clipped message, it meant less and less. The ground, despite its scabs, answered to other things than pedigree. Problems arrived like predictable weather. A delivery of specialized rebar was delayed without explanation. A subcontractor pulled out after reconsidering the logistics. Each delay felt like a finger on my pulse, a test to see whether I'd fold. Most people would have folded. This was a fault line not just on Earth, but in courage. When an inspector issued a red tag, a temporary stop work for an alleged violation, the world narrowed. Headlines loved red tags. Luke's people loved putting them in the mailbox. My stomach went tight when I saw the notice nailed to the gate. The board demanded updates. Investors asked for guarantees. Grace called with a tone that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with worry. "You can handle setbacks," she said. "Just don't let them define you." Ethan and I worked the phones like surgeons. We printed contingency plans and reordered materials. We paid overtime. We replaced an entire concrete batch after lab results. Came back with imperfections. It costs money. It costs sleepless nights. It costs continuing to show up. On the day of the structural review, I climbed into the pit with the foreman boots sinking into wet earth. The inspector moved through the site with a clipboard and an economy of expression. I watched him look at the footings, tap the cured concrete with a hammer, scribble numbers, and calculate tolerances. When he looked up, the site was quiet, waiting for his verdict. "You addressed the concerns," he said almost to himself. "Good reinforcement detail. Proper compaction. I'll clear you on condition of continued oversight." Relief lifted out of me like weight on a breath. The red tag would come down. The machines would roll again. The project would breathe. But the real change wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the faces of the people working the site. Men and women who had once glanced at my boots and my desk now nodded as I passed. The foreman, Steady Carter, who swore he'd seen every kind of boss, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You got grit, kid. Not many stick around long enough to see the second sunrise." Building the foundation was building a language of competence I'd never been allowed to speak in my childhood home. My father measured value in completed towers and glossy headlines. Here I learned to measure value in turned earth and waiting lists for homes in the first smile from a young woman who'd been living in a Haven home because she could finally afford it. When the first frame went up, the site hummed in a new key. Steel rose like a promise. The mud hardened underfoot. Workers who'd once muttered about the CEO's daughter now talked about load-bearing specs and schedule efficiencies. Small victories stacked like bricks. Still, the work took its toll. I lost weekends, friendships frayed, and somewhere in the background, Luke continued to whisper sabotage. He sent an anonymous complaint that triggered a historic audit. He circulated a rumor that my budget line items were padded. Each rumor required a rebuttal and a ledger to back it. It was exhausting, the constant need to prove not just competence, but innocence. Late one night after the crew left, and the floodlights threw long shadows over the half-completed walls, I walked the perimeter. The land had stopped feeling dead and started feeling waiting for the right hands to shape it, waiting for a purpose. The weeds still reached, but now we cut paths through them. I thought of my father's line, "You'll never afford a home," and how close it had come to becoming a prophecy. I didn't buy a home. I built one. The foundation we poured at Crown Point wasn't only concrete and rebar. It was a promise and a proof that land thought dead could be taught to hold life again if someone was willing to do the patient, tedious work of making it so. When the red tag finally came down, I stood in the quiet and let the sound of machinery returning feel for once like applause. The foundation had held. So had I. The article changed everything. Overnight, my phone filled with messages, reporters, local investors, old classmates, suddenly remembering my number. The woman who once sat at the end of the dinner table invisible was now the visionary daughter rebuilding the empire. But with every new headline came new enemies. Luke called first. His voice was ice. "You think one puff piece makes you legitimate? I don't need legitimacy," I said. "Just results. You're playing with my company's name." "Our company," I corrected. Dad made sure of that. The pause on the other end stretched long enough for me to picture his jaw tightening. "You have no idea what you've started," he said finally, and hung up. He was right about one thing I didn't. By the next week, the board demanded updates. Ethan and I presented the latest data. The foundation passed inspections materials under budget, timeline on track. It should have been a victory. Instead, Luke leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "So he said you're building a few homes. Cute. But what's the return?" Ethan started to explain the social impact metrics, but I cut in. "The return is reputation. You want the city to trust the Richardson name again? This is how it starts." He smiled like a predator indulging prey. "And when the trust doesn't pay dividends, then we'll still have done something right," I said. That made him laugh. Short cold practiced. "You sound like Mom," he said. For a second, that stung more than I wanted it to. Later in the elevator, Ethan watched me silently. "You okay, fine?" I said, even though I wasn't. Because the truth was, Luke's words had landed somewhere deep, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed a doubt I hadn't buried as well as I thought. By the end of that week, small problems started appearing. Concrete deliveries delayed. Permits under review. An anonymous complaint to the city inspector. Ethan called it coincidence. I called it Luke. One afternoon, Grace invited me to lunch. She'd been following the progress closely, but there was something in her tone, cautious, almost maternal. "You're getting attention," she said. "That's good. But attention is like sunlight. It can grow things or burn them. I can handle heat," I said. She smiled. "I don't doubt that. But don't mistake persistence for invincibility." I didn't understand what she meant until the next morning when I walked into the site and saw a red tag nailed to the fence. "Construction halted, safety violation." Ethan was already there pacing. "Anonymous report," he said, frustration thick in his voice. "Claimed structural instability, specifically tampering with the concrete mix. We passed inspection last week. This is purely tactical. The city has frozen the permits until the investigation clears." We both turned to the foundation. It looked fine, solid. But the damage wasn't physical, it was legal. Luke's car appeared an hour later, of course. He stepped out dressed like he was heading to a gala, not a construction site. "Heard there was an issue," he said, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Such a shame." "You did this," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "You really think I'd sabotage family property?" "That's a serious accusation, Anna." "Not as serious as fraud," I said quietly. "If I find proof." He smiled, that thin, practiced Richardson smile. "You won't. You never could." When he left, the site fell silent. Ethan kicked at a rock. "We'll fix it. We always do." But I wasn't listening. I was watching the dust rise from the tires of Luke's car, and all I could think was that every war he started made me sharper. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, city lights flickering like Morse code. The news hadn't hit yet, but it would. A halted project was blood in the water. Investors would panic. Grace might pull out and Luke would win without lifting a finger. I opened my laptop and started typing, not an email, not a report. A speech. Something for the press, for the board, for myself. Words that would make this setback sound like strategy. By sunrise, I was ready. At the next board meeting, the whispers were already flying. Structural issues, inexperience, risk. I walked in wearing my calm armor. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "Yes, there's been a temporary pause at Crown Point. The city is conducting a review standard protocol. But I want to be clear, this project isn't failing. It's evolving." Luke smirked. "Evolving into what?" "A landfill into the future of urban housing," I said, turning to the screen. "Here's what the inspectors will find integrity. Here's what we'll find opportunity. When this clears, we'll expand Phase 1 into a full-scale community plan." Grace, seated near the end of the table, watched me closely. When I finished, she nodded once slowly. It was all the confirmation I needed. After the meeting, Luke cornered me by the glass wall overlooking the city. "You don't stop, do you?" "Not until the ground gives way," I said. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Then I'll make sure it does." He walked away before I could reply. 2 weeks later, the investigation cleared no faults, found no tampering confirmed. The red tag came down. Construction resumed. The crew cheered. Ethan hugged me and I laughed for the first time in months. But that night, Grace called. Her tone was different, heavier. "They're watching you now," she said. "Who?" "Everyone who wants you to fail. Don't give them an easy headline." "I won't," I promised. After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. Outside, thunder rolled over the city like a warning. I thought of my father, of the night he told me I'd never afford a home. He'd meant it as a curse, but I was beginning to think it had been a prophecy not of failure but of transformation. Because I wasn't building a home to live in. I was building one to stand. And if cracks appeared along the way, I'd fill them myself, even if I had to use my bare hands. The morning the storm hit the sky was the color of slate and the air thick enough to taste. I stood on the balcony of my apartment watching the clouds roll over the city like a bruise. The forecast said light rain. They were wrong. By noon, the wind had turned violent, tearing through traffic lights and bending street signs. At Crown Point, workers scrambled to secure the site, shouting over the roar of thunder. My hands were full wrestling a stack of old blueprints onto my kitchen table when my phone tucked in my jacket pocket started vibrating. Ethan called me 3 times before I finally managed to stabilize the papers and grab the phone. "Where are you?" he yelled through static. "On my way," I said, grabbing my keys. "Don't. It's bad out here." "The scaffoldings." The line cut out. I grabbed my jacket and keys, ignoring the sirens blaring from every direction. Rain hammered the windshield wipers, useless against the flood. By the time I reached Crown Point, the road was half underwater. Trucks sat idle, lights flashing through sheets of rain. Ethan stood near the fence, soaked and shouting orders. "Get everyone out!" he yelled as I ran up. The northwest frames bending, the wind hit like a slap. I could barely see through the downpour. Water rushed around my boots, turning the ground into sludge. I spotted the skeletal frame of the first building, the one we'd spent months erecting, swaying like it was alive. "Is anyone still inside?" I shouted. He hesitated. 2 workers checking the wiring. Without thinking, I sprinted across the site. Ethan cursed behind me, following. The rain stung my face, my lungs burned, but adrenaline made everything feel distant, slow. Inside the half-built structure, the wind howled through open walls. Metal groaned overhead. "Hey!" I shouted. 2 figures turned, young, terrified. "Out, now." They hesitated, frozen between fear and disbelief. Then a deafening crack split the air. One of the beams gave way, crashing down, sparks exploding as it hit a generator. Ethan lunged forward, grabbing my arm. Move! We barely made it out before the side wall collapsed. A cloud of dust and rain exploded behind us. I hit the mud hard, my breath gone. For a second, everything was soundless. Just the pulse in my ears and the weight of wet concrete somewhere too close. When I opened my eyes, Ethan was kneeling beside me. You good? I nodded, coughing. Everyone! He looked back at the workers huddled by the fence. All out. Scared to death but alive. I turned to the site. Half the frame was gone torn like paper. The rest stood in jagged defiance against the storm. The news came fast. By evening, the city declared Crown Point unsafe. Reporters camped outside the site, drones buzzing overhead. One headline read, Crown Point collapse. The Richardson curse continues. Luke didn't wait long. He called during the cleanup, his tone dripping with satisfaction. You just made my job easier, he said. Don't call me, I snapped. You embarrassed the company. The board wants blood. Guess whose I ended the call before he finished. By nightfall, the rain eased. The site was a swamp of debris and silence. The city inspectors would arrive in the morning, but I already knew the verdict: temporary shutdown pending review. Ethan walked beside me, limping slightly. Could have been worse, he said quietly. It was bad enough, I replied. He looked at me, then really looked. You can't take all the blame for this. I can, I said, and I will. We stood there for a long time, listening to the water drip from twisted steel. The lights of the city glimmered faintly beyond the fog, like they were watching. When I finally went home, the silence of my apartment felt foreign. My clothes still smelled like smoke and rain. I sank onto the couch exhausted, but my mind wouldn't stop. The image of the collapse replayed on a loop, the bending frame, the crack, the fall. At 3 a.m, I opened my laptop. Photos of the site filled the screen, destruction framed in perfect media clarity. I scrolled through them, each headline another nail in the coffin. Then one caught my eye. Anonymous source claims poor material quality at Haven Homes site. Anonymous. Luke's favorite word. I closed the laptop. Rage and exhaustion fought inside me until only clarity remained. If they wanted a villain, I'd give them a survivor. The next day I showed up at the Richardson boardroom. My clothes still smelled faintly of smoke. Luke was already there, smug arms crossed. You've done enough, he said. Resign now, and we'll minimize the damage. I walked past him straight to the head of the table. Crown Point isn't dead, I said. The storm exposed weak joints. We'll rebuild them stronger. I'm asking for 2 weeks to prove it. The board exchanged glances. Mr. Grayson frowned. 2 weeks? The site's a liability. It's a lesson, I said. And I'm not walking away from it. Luke scoffed. This is pathetic. I met his eyes. You think rebuilding is a weakness? That's why you'll never understand the legacy. For once, he didn't have a comeback. The vote was close, but Grace tipped the balance. 2 weeks, she said. But no extensions. After the meeting, Luke followed me into the hallway. You're going to drown in that mud, Anna. And I won't be there to pull you out. I smiled. That's what I'm counting on. The next day, I was back on site. The workers looked wary, tired. I stood in the mud and addressed them directly. We're not here to erase a mistake, I said. We're here to build through it. What fell yesterday will stand tomorrow because we will make it. They didn't cheer. They just nodded. That was better. Ethan handed me a hard hat. You really think we can pull this off in 2 weeks? I don't think, I said. I know. We worked until sunset. The wreckage became blueprints. The mud became ground again. That night the wind had died, but its echo remained a hum in the air, a promise in my chest. The storm had tried to break me. Instead, it cleared the sky. For the first time, I could see the horizon beyond the ruins, and it looked a lot like victory. The storm had left scars, but it also left clarity. 2 weeks. That's all I had, not to survive, but to rise. Every headline said I was finished. Every board member except Grace had already written my obituary in the family records. And Luke. He was waiting for the funeral. The first morning back at Crown Point, the air was cold and sharp. Puddles had frozen overnight, reflecting the fractured skeletons of the buildings we'd lost. I walked the perimeter alone before the crew arrived. Each bent beam, each broken frame, all of it told the same story. You shouldn't have tried, but I had. And I wasn't done. Ethan joined me with 2 coffees. You didn't sleep, did you? I took the cup. Sleep's a luxury. We're in survival mode now. He smiled, shaking his head. You and your war metaphors. Wars build empires, I said. We're just building homes. We started with the debris. Everything damaged was cleared, cataloged, and replaced. I spent hours in the mud with the crew gloves on boots soaked. When the camera crews came looking for another disaster photo, they found us working quiet, focused, relentless. Within 3 days, new frames were up. Reinforced steel, higher-grade materials, more secure foundations. I didn't just want to rebuild. I wanted to erase the possibility of collapse forever. At night, I reviewed every invoice personally. Grace called once late, her voice softer than usual. You're doing the work of 10 people. Feels like 20, I said. You remind me of someone, she said. Your mother. That stopped me. She gave up on this family a long time ago. No, Grace said quietly. She survived them. There's a difference. The next morning, the inspector came early. Clipboard in hand, hard hat gleaming, he moved through the site with slow, deliberate steps. Luke had clearly sent him. After an hour of silence, he turned to me. You fixed the flaws. Good work. I'll sign off the clearance. Ethan exhaled. I didn't. Not yet. How long until it's official, I asked. 3 days, he said. Assuming no interference. I nodded. Thank you. When he left, Ethan grinned. We might actually make it. Might isn't good enough, I said. But deep down, something shifted hope fragile and dangerous. That night we stayed late again. I climbed the half-finished stairwell to the second floor of the main building. From there, the city lights stretched out like a river of gold. Luke's towers glittered among them, proud and untouchable. I whispered to the empty air, let's see how high I can climb without your permission. Below, Ethan shouted something I couldn't hear over the hum of the generators. I turned and saw him waving a flashlight, pointing to the corner where the roof frame met the wall. Look at that, he yelled. The first finished section, flawless alignment, solid as stone. It wasn't much, but it was ours. By the end of the first week, the site looked alive again. Trucks came and went, concrete, poured smooth beams gleamed under the sun. Workers laughed for the first time in months. Even the foreman, a stoic man named Carter, cracked a rare grin. But the peace didn't last. On the 8th day, I arrived to find the main gate locked chains and a bright red notice, temporary work stop. Financial compliance review. Ethan cursed under his breath. You've got to be kidding me. I already knew what it was. Luke's last card, an audit request. By noon, the financial team had arrived. 3 suits, all smiles and clipped voices. Standard procedure, one said. Just checking the numbers. They spent hours poring over our ledgers, receipts, permits, anything they could twist into suspicion. I sat across from them, answering questions until my throat went dry. Finally, one of them looked up. Your expenses are unusually high for the last 2 weeks. Rebuilding after a collapse tends to do that, I said. He smiled thinly. We'll be in touch. That night I went back to my apartment and found an envelope slipped under the door. No return address. Inside was a single photo, me and Ethan at the site standing too close mid-laugh. And scrawled in marker beneath it, unprofessional conduct. Reckless leadership. I froze. Luke was trying to turn perception into poison. I called Ethan. They're coming for reputation next. Then we stay quiet, he said. Let the work speak. It wasn't just work anymore. It was a war in silence. 3 days later, the inspector returned. He handed me a signed clearance stamped and dated. Congratulations, he said. You passed every metric. I held the paper, feeling the weight of months of exhaustion pressed into that single sheet. Thank you, I said, but my voice broke. As he left, Ethan clapped me on the shoulder. "You did it." "We did it," I corrected. The next day, I stood on site as the first delivery of new materials arrived the final batch. The morning sun hit the steel, turning it silver bright. Workers moved in rhythm cranes, lifting beams into place. The sound of progress was deafening beautiful. When the first full structure stood complete, unshaken, gleaming proud, the crew gathered around. Someone started clapping. It spread slowly, awkwardly, then louder, until the whole site echoed with applause. Ethan leaned in, smiling. "You know, for someone who hates attention," I laughed, the sound raw and real. "Yeah, well, maybe I'm learning to like it." Later that evening, I returned to the same spot I'd stood on after the storm. The mud was gone. The ground was firm. The wind carried a faint scent of wet concrete and possibility. I thought of Luke's threats, of Dad's voice echoing from that barbecue years ago. "You'll never afford a home." He was right. I wasn't going to afford one. I was going to own the necessity of it. Grace called just as the sun dipped below the skyline. I heard she said simply, "Crown Point passed." "It did," I said. "You've done what most men in that family never could," she said. "You earned your name." When the call ended, I stayed on site watching the floodlights flicker on one by one. Each glow felt like a heartbeat, steady, unyielding. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel like I was proving something. I felt like I'd become something. Crown Point wasn't just a construction site anymore. It was a monument to every no I'd ever been given. And as I turned to leave, one thought followed me like a whisper in the dark. The rebuild was done, but the reckoning was just beginning. The day Crown Point reopened, the air buzzed with a strange electricity. The press called it the comeback project, and even the most cynical investors started to soften. For the first time, I walked through those steel gates without fear. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, something inside me whispered that it wasn't over. By noon, the boardroom filled with faces that used to doubt me. Grace sat at the head, calm and sharp. Luke was late as usual, probably waiting for the perfect moment to make an entrance. When he finally walked in, the air shifted. His tie was immaculate, his smirk lazy. He looked like someone who already knew the ending of a story. "Congratulations," he said, taking his seat. "You've managed to keep the headlines positive for a whole week." "Impressive." "I wasn't trying to impress anyone," I said. "Just do my job." "Of course," he said, his voice smooth. "That's what all martyrs say." Grace cleared her throat. "Let's focus. Crown Point's ahead of schedule, under budget, and generating positive press. That's a rare combination." Luke leaned back, tapping a pen against the table. "Until it isn't." The meeting continued, numbers, forecasts, next phases. Everything was steady, logical, professional. But Luke's silence was too deliberate, his calm too staged. When I glanced his way, he was already watching me, a faint smile tugging at his lips. After the meeting, Grace caught me in the hallway. "He's planning something," she said quietly. "I know. Be careful, Anna. Pride makes smart men stupid." "I'm not the one who's proud," I said. But I was wrong. Pride was exactly what had been keeping me standing. 2 days later, the betrayal landed. It started with a phone call from the bank. "Ms. Richardson," the voice said, "we've received a withdrawal request from your business account." A large one. "I didn't authorize any withdrawal," I said immediately. There was a pause. "The authorization came from your partner." My blood turned cold. "What partner?" "According to your corporate filing, co-signed last month, Mr. Luke Richardson." The forged partnership papers dropped from my hand. He'd forged the documents. I knew it before I even saw them. Within hours, I was in the office, tearing through files. Ethan found me there, surrounded by open drawers. "What happened?" "He signed himself into the company," I said. "Used my own signature against me." "How the compliance audit?" "He planted someone inside accounting. While we were rebuilding, he was building his trap." Ethan swore under his breath. "We can fight it." "We will," I said, even though my voice shook. The next morning, I confronted Luke at the Richardson Tower. He was waiting in his glass-walled office, the city sprawling behind him like a trophy. "You forged documents," I said. "You stole from the company." He didn't even flinch. "I restructured ownership. You should thank me, it keeps the business in the family." I slammed a folder on his desk. "You use my name, my work, my project. You want to claim it now that it's thriving. Claim it?" He stood smiling. "I built this family's empire while you played architect. You think one development makes you a CEO?" "I don't need to think about it," I said. "I am already." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You don't understand, Anna. You're a figurehead. Always have been. The board voted this morning control mine again." I froze. "You went around Grace." "She stepped down," he said simply. "Health reasons." The words hit harder than I expected. Grace would never have quit, not willingly. "What did you do?" "Offered her a graceful exit. She took it. For a moment, I couldn't breathe." Luke adjusted his cufflinks the same way Dad used to before delivering bad news. "You wanted to build homes? Go ahead. But you're out of Richardson Estates." I turned for the door, but his next words stopped me. "Oh, and Anna," he said, "you should check your email. The press loves stories about family feuds." He was right. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone was buzzing nonstop. Richardson's siblings at war, allegations of mismanagement rock real estate empire. I stood in the elevator numb as the floor numbers blinked past. The city below was bright, merciless. That night I didn't go home. I found Grace at a quiet bar downtown, the kind of place where money didn't talk, it just drank. She didn't look sick. She looked worn down. I didn't have to ask about Luke. The empty glass in her hand spoke volumes. "He threatened my foundation," she said finally, her voice low and rough. "Not my money, my integrity." I felt the truth of her words settle into me cold and heavy. This wasn't just a business fight. It was an attempt to dismantle the moral structure I'd built. Luke hadn't just stolen a company. He'd poisoned the trust of the one person who believed in me unconditionally. "He won't get away with it," I whispered, the words barely audible. Grace looked at me, her eyes tired, but clear. Sometimes, Anna, winning means walking away with your soul intact. The power they seek isn't worth the price. I left the bar with a new kind of resolve. It wasn't about the company anymore. It was about proving that integrity could still stand even when the foundations of your own family were rotten. When the doors opened, Ethan was waiting. He didn't need to ask. "It's him," I said. He nodded. "Then we take him down." For the next 48 hours, we worked in silence. We traced documents, found inconsistencies, and built a trail. Grace's name was missing from every new filing. When I called her, she didn't answer. Instead, her assistant emailed a single line, "Check the escrow reports." That's where we found it, the real betrayal. Luke had been diverting funds from multiple projects for months, masking them as executive transfers. Enough to ruin him publicly. But exposing him meant taking the entire family name down with him. That night I sat in the office staring at the glowing skyline, the same city Dad said I'd never afford to live in. The irony almost made me laugh. Ethan placed a hand on my shoulder. "We can leak it anonymously," he said. "Let the evidence speak." I looked up at him. "You think the truth is enough? It has to be." The next morning we sent the files. Not to the police, not to the board, to the press. By afternoon, CNN had picked it up, Richardson's CEO under investigation for financial misconduct. Luke's face was everywhere. The same smirk he'd worn while mocking me now looked hollow on screen. My phone rang, an unknown number. When I answered, his voice was raw, furious. "You think this makes you righteous?" "No," I said. "It makes me free." There was silence. Then a quiet laugh that sent a chill down my spine. "You've started something you can't control." He hung up. That night I walked through Crown Point again. The lights from the finished homes glowed warm against the darkness. Families had started moving in, laughter echoing from open windows. It should have been peaceful. But deep down I knew this wasn't the end. Revenge has a way of circling back. And in families like ours, every victory comes with a price. The betrayal wasn't the collapse. It was the foundation. It exposed a truth I could no longer ignore. The Richardsons had built their empire on cracks. Now it was my turn to decide whether to repair them or watch it all fall. The first time I saw my father after the scandal broke, he didn't look angry. He looked terrified. He was sitting on the porch of the old family house, the same one where he'd once laughed at me across a barbecue pit, beer in hand, calling me a dreamer. Now his hands trembled as he held the newspaper. My brother's face glared back from the front page under a headline that read, "Richardson Empire under Federal Review." When I stepped out of the car, he didn't stand. He just looked up slowly, eyes bloodshot, pride stripped clean. So he said, his voice rough, "You did it." "I didn't leak lies," I said. "I told the truth." He laughed once, bitter and low. "Truth. The truth is, you destroyed this family." "This family destroyed itself," I said. "I just stopped pretending." He slammed the paper onto the table. "Do you know what you've done? Luke could go to prison. Then he finally gets to build something real walls around himself," I said. He stared at me stunned. "You sound just like your mother." I almost smiled. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." He didn't answer. The silence between us felt heavier than it ever had. When I turned to leave, he said, "You think this makes you better than us?" "No," I said, looking back. "It makes me free from you." That night I drove back to the city and parked outside the Richardson Tower. The building glowed like a ghost, half its windows dark, half still lit with panic. Inside, the board was collapsing. Investors pulling out projects, freezing stock, dropping by the hour. Luke was missing. No one had seen him since the news hit. Grace called me past midnight. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "They're asking if you'll take control." I closed my eyes. Of what? The ashes? "Of the name," she said. "Someone has to clean it." I thought of that name, Richardson, the same one I'd spent my life trying to outrun. "Let them burn it," I said. There was a long pause. "Be careful what you burn, Anna. Sometimes you need a firelight to see your way home." The next morning, CNN called. They wanted an exclusive. "You're the only Richardson not accused of wrongdoing," the producer said. "People want to hear your side." For years, I'd dreamed of that moment to finally be seen to tell my story. But now that it was here, it felt like a trap. Fame wasn't freedom. It was just another cage. Still, I agreed. When the camera lights came on, I could see my reflection in the lens, steady, calm, older than I remembered. Anna, the interviewer, began. "Your brother is under investigation. Your father's company is in crisis, and yet Crown Point continues to grow. How do you explain that?" "By not being afraid to rebuild," I said. "Every house starts with broken ground. You can't create anything worth keeping if you're scared of cracks." "And your father? Your brother? Do you blame them?" I paused. The studio was silent. "No," I said finally. "I don't blame them. I learned from them. They taught me exactly what kind of person I didn't want to become." The interview went viral before I even left the studio. The daughter who dared to rebuild, one headline called me. The new face of real estate redemption, said another. That night my phone buzzed endlessly. Reporters, investors, strangers thanking me for inspiring them. It should have felt like victory, but all I felt was tired. Ethan showed up with takeout and 2 beers. "You're officially America's sweetheart," he said, setting the bag on the counter. I laughed softly. "That's one way to say, publicly dissected." He looked at me carefully. "You did the right thing, Anna. Don't doubt that," maybe I said. But right doesn't always feel good. We ate in silence for a while, watching the city lights outside. "Do you ever think it would end like this?" he asked. "I never thought it would end," I said. "I thought it would just change shape." The next morning, the board didn't just send an email, they sent a delegation. I was pulled from my Haven Homes office to the now shuttered Richardson boardroom. The long mahogany table, once dominated by my father's power, now felt heavy with absence. 3 remaining directors sat stone-faced. They didn't apologize for the past, but their desperation was palpable. "We're hemorrhaging capital," Mr. Grayson stated, avoiding my eyes. "We need a face that inspires trust. Someone with clean hands and a viable project." The senior director slid a document across the polished surface. I didn't need to read the fine print. It was the formal resignation letters from every remaining board member save those 3, followed by a single typed sentence, effective immediately, "You are appointed interim CEO of Richardson Estates." I stared at it for a long time, the paper feeling thin and sharp. Ethan found me sitting on the floor, laptop still open. "You're not celebrating," he said. "I don't know if it's a win," I said quietly, "or a warning." But by evening I was back in that tower, the same one where I'd been dismissed, humiliated, erased. Now it was mine. I walked through the lobby alone. The marble floor echoed under my heels. The receptionist, a woman I remembered from my early days as an intern, looked up, eyes wide. "Miss Richardson," she said, "do we call you CEO now?" "Call me Anna," I said with a small smile. "Titles don't build houses. People do." On the top floor, Luke's office was dark. His nameplate was gone. His desk was bare except for one thing, a single photo of us as kids, standing in front of Dad's first construction site covered in mud. On the back in Luke's handwriting, "We built this together once." For the first time, I felt the weight of what I'd done, not regret exactly, but recognition. Justice always came with casualties. When I left the office, the night air felt different, lighter. The city skyline stretched before me, glittering like an open door. Back home, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window watching the lights flicker across the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear faint music, a party laughter, life moving on. Dad once told me I'd never afford a home. He was right in a way. I didn't buy one. I built a world of them, brick by brick, betrayal by betrayal, truth by truth. And now, standing at the top of what remained of our empire, I realized something simple and terrifying. The reckoning wasn't a scandal. It wasn't Luke's fall or my rise. The reckoning was realizing that I'd become the very thing they feared most. A Richardson with power. And this time, no one could take it from me. The Richardson mansion hadn't changed in years. The same white columns, the same manicured lawn, the same smug silence that had once made me feel small. Only this time, I wasn't the girl who stood outside waiting to be invited in. I was the woman who owned half the estate that kept its gates closed to me. It was Thanksgiving again, full circle. The smell of smoked turkey and expensive wine drifted through the open window. I could hear laughter from the dining room, the same brittle sound that used to slice through my confidence. Only now it didn't cut anymore. It barely touched me. I hadn't planned to go back. But the call from my mother had been brief and trembling. "Your father's not well. He wants to see you." So I came. Not for him, but maybe somewhere deep down for closure. When I walked through the doorway, every conversation in the room stopped. My father sat at the head of the table, thinner, now skin pale, but his eyes still sharp enough to command a room. Luke wasn't there. The empty chair beside him said everything. Mom stood quickly, her smile fragile. "Anna, you look strong." "I had to be," I said softly. For a moment the silence was awkward, suspended in the air like dust. Then Dad gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. I took the seat, feeling every pair of eyes on me. The same cousins who had laughed years ago at my old car now avoided my gaze. Grace, sitting at the far end, gave me a familiar silent nod. She was here as a family friend, a quiet sentinel, who no longer carried the burden of the Richardson board. Dad cleared his throat. "I suppose congratulations are in order. CNN can't stop saying your name." "I didn't ask them to," I said. "But you didn't stop them either. I stopped pretending I was invisible." He stared at me for a long time. "You think you've won something I didn't come here to win," I said. "I came because you asked." The words seemed to disarm him. He shifted in his chair, looking smaller, older. "Luke's gone," he said finally. "Left the country before the indictment came through." The room stirred with whispers. I stayed silent. He was reckless, Dad continued. But he was still my son. I know, I said quietly. And I was still your daughter. That hit him like a blow. His hand trembled slightly as he lifted his glass. You always were, he said almost to himself. I just didn't see it until it was too late. The sound of silverware clinking returned, filling the silence. The conversation shifted safe topics, weather business, anything but the wreckage between us. But every time my father looked at me, something in his eyes changed. Maybe regret. Maybe respect. Halfway through dinner, Mom leaned closer, her voice low. He's proud of you, you know. He'll never say it, but he is. I smiled faintly. That makes one of us. Dessert came pumpkin pie just like every year, the same one I used to serve while Luke boasted about bonuses. Now it was quiet. No laughter, no applause. Just forks scraping porcelain and the faint hum of a house that had seen too much. When the plates were cleared, Dad pushed his chair back and stood. Anna, come with me, he said. He led me out to the back porch, where the barbecue pit still stood, the same one where it all began. The same place he'd told me I'd never afford a home. The night air was cold, the sky clear. He stared at the coals, long dead, now gray and silent. I used to think success was about control, he said finally. Owning everything so no one could take it from me. I built an empire, but I lost the foundation. You didn't lose it, I said. You ignored it. He nodded slow. You were right about Luke. He thought money made him untouchable. I thought pride made me right. Turns out both of us were wrong. The silence that followed wasn't hostile anymore. It was heavy, yes, but honest. He looked at me, his expression softening. You remind me of your mother when she left. She had that same fire. I used to think it was defiance. It was survival, I said. He sighed, long and tired. Maybe that's what this family needed all along. We stood there for a while, watching the wind scatter ash from the old pit. The same fire that once humiliated me had burned itself out. Before I turned to leave, he said quietly, You built something real, Anna. Don't let it become like this house, all show, no heart. I met his eyes. Then don't let it end this way either. When I walked back inside, the conversation had softened. Mom was clearing plates, Grace helping her. The cousins were gathered around the fireplace, laughing again, but this time it sounded real. As I reached for my coat, Mom stopped me. Stay a little longer, she asked. I can't, I said gently. I've got an early meeting tomorrow. She smiled sadly. Always working, always building, I corrected. Outside, the night felt cleaner somehow. The air carried no bitterness, no sting, just the faint echo of something ending and something else beginning. At the gate, I looked back once. The mansion glowed behind me, smaller now, or maybe I was just seeing it clearly for the first time. My phone buzzed. A message from CNN. Interview request. Forbes wants a follow-up feature on Haven Homes. You're officially on their billionaires to watch list. I stared at the screen for a long moment before slipping it back into my pocket. The girl who couldn't afford a home was now being watched for the empire she built. And somewhere behind those glowing windows, the man who once mocked her was finally quiet. The return wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about rewriting the story from the same place it had begun, only this time I was the one holding the match. The call came just after sunrise. Anna, it's official. Grace said, her voice steady and proud. Forbes just confirmed it. You're their cover story. America's youngest real estate billionaire. I sat there for a moment, phone pressed against my ear, the morning light spilling across my desk. The words didn't sound real. Billionaire. The kind of title my father once reserved for men in suits, he envied for men he thought I could never compete with. Now it was attached to me, the daughter he told would never afford a home. Grace kept talking, but her words blurred into the hum of the city outside. I looked out the window, the top floor of the Haven Homes tower, and for the first time I saw my reflection in the glass and didn't flinch. By noon my inbox was flooded. Invitations, partnerships, congratulations from people who had never once believed in me. Ethan leaned against the doorway of my office, coffee in hand. You know, most people would be out celebrating right now, he said. I smiled. I've celebrated enough in silence. He raised a brow. So what happens now? Now, I said, turning toward the skyline. Now I will build the next step. That evening my phone buzzed again, a text from my mother. Dinner tonight. The family wants to talk. Your father too. For a moment I hesitated. I'd already said everything I needed to. But something in me, curiosity, closure, maybe both, told me to go. The restaurant was private, quiet, the kind of place Dad used to bring clients to show off. When I arrived, the host smiled nervously. Miss Richardson, your family's already here. They were waiting at a round table near the back. My father sat at the center, flanked by Mom and Luke's empty chair. He looked tired, older than I remembered, but his eyes still carried that sharpness, now dulled but not gone. As I approached the room, fell silent. Anna, Dad said. You made it. I always make it, I said. He managed a small smile. I suppose you do. For a while we ate in silence. No barbs, no laughter, just the quiet clink of silverware. It felt foreign, almost fragile. Then Dad set down his glass. You've done something extraordinary, he said. The kind of thing I never thought possible. You didn't think I could do it, I corrected. He didn't argue. You proved me wrong. Mom reached across the table, her hand trembling slightly. We're proud of you, sweetheart. The words should have warmed me. Instead, they just hung there, late and fragile. It took a long time to say that I said softly. I know, she whispered. Dad leaned forward. I want to make things right, he said. The company, the name, we can rebuild it. Together. For a long moment I said nothing. Then I met his gaze. You can rebuild your reputation, Dad. I've already built my legacy. He flinched, the truth cutting sharper than I expected. So that's it, he said quietly. You're done with us. No, I said. I'm done living small so you can feel big. The silence that followed was heavy, final. Then he nodded slowly, almost in surrender. You really are your mother's daughter. I smiled faintly. You should have realized that sooner. After dinner I walked outside. The city lights stretched endlessly. The same lights I used to stare at from my cracked apartment window years ago. I remembered the noise, the fear, the exhaustion, and how every one of those nights had led me here. Behind me the restaurant door opened. Grace stepped out, wrapping her coat tighter. I saw the article, she said. They called you a self-made billionaire. I laughed softly. Self-made is a myth. Nobody builds anything alone. You're right, she said. But some people have to build in spite of everyone else. I looked at her. Thank you, Grace. For everything. She smiled. You don't owe me thanks. You owe yourself peace. When she left, I stood there for a while, letting the city breathe around me. Then my phone buzzed again, a call from CNN. Anna, we'd love to do a follow-up interview. The world wants to know what's next. I paused. The dinner had closed a chapter. The interview would open another. Tell them I'll answer that in person, I said. The next morning I walked into the same studio where they'd once introduced me as a rising entrepreneur. Now the crew whispered my name with awe. The host smiled as the cameras started rolling. Anna Richardson. She began your story, has inspired millions from family rejection to Forbes billionaire. What does success feel like now? I smiled, calm and deliberate. It feels like freedom, I said. But not the kind that comes from money. The kind that comes from knowing who you are when the laughter fades. The host leaned in. And what would you say to those who once doubted you? I met the camera's lens head on. I'd say thank you. Without their doubt, I might never have found my fire. When the interview ended, the producer whispered, You just broke another record. Most viewed segment this month. But I didn't care about records anymore. I cared about what came next. That night back in my office, I stood by the window again, the same place where it had all started. The skyline shimmered alive and infinite. Below, I could see the lights of Crown Point families moving into the homes I'd built, kids playing in the yards where there used to be rubble. That was the real empire. Not the towers or the title, but the lives changed by what rose from the ashes. My phone buzzed again, this time from Ethan. "We're ready for the next project." "What do we call it?" I typed back. "The foundation." I set the phone down and walked to the edge of the glass, placing my hand flat against the cool surface. The city was a grid of ambition, and for the first time I wasn't an outsider looking in. I was a builder looking out. I realized the truth wasn't that I was now richer than my father or more powerful than Luke. The victory was far simpler. I had taken the deepest curse, the shame of being houseless and unchosen, and turned it into a shelter for others. My purpose wasn't to manage the old Richardson empire, but to lay down a new kind of ground. I closed my eyes, feeling the silent, steady hum of the city beneath me.